Welcome to Know Your Food, the podcast where we explore the world of food by speaking with farmers, makers, entrepreneurs, and experts who are reshaping how we think about what we eat. I'm your host, Michael Ray Robinoff, CEO and co-founder of Farm to People, and we're recording these conversations live from our warehouse in Bushwick, Brooklyn. In today's episode, I sit down with Alicia Kennedy, a prolific food writer and cultural critic whose work explores the intersections of food, politics, and identity. We talk about what it really means to build regional food systems, the disconnect between food trends and food justice, and how the media shapes our collective imagination about what's normal to eat. Alicia brings sharp insight and grounded nuance to conversations around plant-based eating, climate action, and why we need to shift from seeing local food as a luxury to understanding it as a necessity. This is one of the most thought-provoking conversations I've had in the series, challenging, urgent, and deeply rooted in care. If you enjoyed today's episode, please subscribe and share it with someone you know who thinks critically and eats with intention. Now here's my conversation with Alicia Kennedy. Thank you so much, Alicia, for being here tonight. I think we're all really, really excited to have you in New York City, and especially here at Farm to People.
Yes, thank you for having me. Yes.
Great. So we're picking a really, really simple topic tonight, but a really important one, which is, and it's not simple at all, I think, the power in regional food systems. That's really the mission of Farm to People. It's what we're building here in New York City, is sort of a version of what we hope a thriving regional food system can look like. And we're really, at the logistics point in that system where we're not the farmer or the consumer, but we want to more directly connect those two. Starting with your writing, you've covered many aspects of food. And in this conversation, we're choosing to focus on this topic. So I just wanted to start with your vision of what a regional food system could look like beyond just shopping locally. What infrastructure must be in place to make it work?
I think that this is a great example because it is doing that middleman work that other people don't want to do. It's not just bringing the food to people, but it's also doing some processing as well. It's also that aesthetic aspect of having a bar and having a restaurant and making it more approachable to think about what it means to eat locally and seasonally. In New York State, we have really great support robust support, let's say, for local agriculture, for local producers and that sort of thing. But when, it's never going to be enough, right? Until it's easy for people to access this food and to think about how to eat it. So for me, obviously, because I'm a food writer, I'm trying to complicate notions of what it is to eat locally and seasonally for people and name it as something a little bit bigger and broader, such as a regional food system or a city region food system, because I think that when people say, oh, eat local, eat seasonal, and that's sustainable, I think that people kind of shut their ears off and they don't think of it from that more systemic perspective where they're not just a consumer, they're a person in a regional system that has to function in very specific ways to be resilient in the future. And I think that that's a huge part of regional food systems that people don't think about enough. It is something that people are talking about. I get the New York State Department of Agriculture emails, and they're always like, we're trying to make ourselves resilient to disaster. And I think that's a good thing. Like, that needs to be said. Coming from living in Puerto Rico for the last 6 years, I have seen how important that is. How important it is for there to be robust local food production because imports cannot be relied upon when disaster strikes. And so then what are you going to do? What are you going to feed yourself? And so I talk about it from the perspective of how can you ground yourself so completely in a way of eating that is not just sustainable on this weird imaginative level of I eat sustainably. It's what does that mean? What does it mean to eat sustainably? It means to ground yourself in the place where you are. That doesn't mean you don't get to eat anything or drink anything from elsewhere, but it means that your foundation for how you approach your mode of eating is extremely rooted in where you are and who's around you and the local ecosystem. Because if that's not robust, you don't have food when things are bad, or you just have cans of stuff, it's not really enjoyable. And so, as a food writer, my perspective on this is it's about complicating the easy ways in which people say local, sustainable, seasonal to mean something more than just a bourgeois affectation. And it's also to talk about how if you don't have a commitment to this, you don't get to enjoy food at a later date. And I think that's something that people are a little bit uncomfortable often with the food writer saying. They want you to be very gentle and nice about everything. And I think that I am, I think I am gentle and nice about this as in as much as I can be gentle and nice about climate disasters and greenhouse gas emissions. I don't, it's like, how nice am I supposed to be about these things from my perspective? And I'm always coming at it from a food writer, of course, because I'm not an urban planner, I'm not an economist, but I do read what those people are writing. And how that flows through my work is in this idea that you have to root yourself. And rooting yourself doesn't mean that the food all comes from down the street or something like that. We are in a regional food shed, and that's something you have to think about. And I think thinking about it like that is really helpful to that imaginative hurdle that people hit when they feel very overwhelmed by eating in a different way or eating with ecology in mind or that sort of thing.
So this is more than like a lifestyle choice. There's a part of this that's also like ringing alarm bells.
Yes.
That's saying like make yourself aware of where you live and what's available to you naturally.
Exactly. And I mean, as a food writer, you come to this question from people's attachments to supermarkets. Mm-hmm. People are attached to supermarkets. It's really changed the psychology of how people think about food and what should be available. I think about this all the time in terms of friends in Puerto Rico who live in my neighborhood, but we eat very differently because I have prioritized eating what is grown locally and what's in season, even if that means we eat bok choy 2 or 3 times a week and I don't have tomatoes. My thinking around food has changed so significantly that I don't even consider eating an apple when I'm in Puerto Rico, because why would I do that?
And here, I think what's crazy is people, and sales, and I think our customer is a pretty conscious customer.
Yeah.
Yet, our best-selling produce items are avocados, bananas, and lemons. So it's like, to your point, apples do sell, but
of course, but people should be eating apples here more than avocados and bananas. But yeah. I mean, I crave an apple because I don't eat them as much.
Yeah.
But, a banana and an avocado, I have just no desire for anymore.
Yeah.
Like, I eat them because but I've just been so thoroughly inundated that there's just nothing special about them anymore. That sounds terrible.
You think that's because you've written about it? You've through all the research, through what you know, it's turned you off to them?
I mean, if I'm here, do I want to eat bananas and avocados? No. But I find it difficult in New York to eat as a vegetarian and not constantly eat avocados. Whereas in Puerto Rico, even though avocados grow and they have a very specific season, I can eat them more judiciously. But here, it's like avocado on everything, banana on everything. And it's like, why is this happening?
Yeah.
Why this attachment to what isn't local is very... and I understand that I sound like, silly because but I think if you change your mindset around these things, it becomes strange to become dependent on food that isn't from where you are.
I completely agree. On that note, and I think that's an interesting point because you're obviously someone who's written a lot about being a plant-based person. I was curious, as someone who's from the Northeast and has from New York City, and thinks a lot about geographical differences and how diet changes from geography to geography. Do you feel that like a plant-based diet in, let's say, the northeast of America or the north of Europe, or I guess a more northern region where the sort of growing season is much shorter and you're relying more on fermentation, on canning, and possibly also on hunting and other things like that? What's your sort of perspective on how diets should change around the world?
Well, I don't like to use the word should because some second wave feminists told me it's patriarchal once. And so I try not to say should. And I don't think, when we're talking about like regional food systems, there's so many different ways to eat. And that can be a beautiful part of eating, is that when you go somewhere new, even though it's maybe not around the world, you can eat very differently if things are tended to and if things are considered important in their seasons. Like I think about, obviously here, like people love tomato season, but there's also places where I remember when we were in Baltimore on my book tour and I was given a gift of pawpaw, which I had never had. And so it's like, when you think about these things becoming more, if more things become special and important, it becomes more interesting to travel even not very far, which is, I think is something that is an undersung aspect of kind of breaking out of like supermarket hegemony. I think anyone in any climate can be plant-based to whatever degree is comfortable for them, of course. Like I used to be vegan. I found it really easy to be vegan when I lived in New York City. But at the same time, at the end of my time in New York, which I didn't really know at the time was the end of it, I was really like, why am I eating all this cashew stuff? Why am I eating all this coconut stuff? Like, none of this makes any sense. Even from a nutritional standpoint, cashews have a lot of nutrition, but it's like, there's so much coconut. I was just like, this isn't even nutritionally like useful to me at all. And so, I was just really considering whether it would make more sense for me to be vegetarian. Of course, there are places in the world where it makes more sense for people to eat animals. I remember reading *An Eating to Extinction* by Dan Saladino, which is a great book about people, think Finland or don't quote me, but it was very far north. But they were living off of the milk of these specific animals and, using the fur of them to keep warm. And then every part of the animal was used for a very specific reason for them. I'm coming to this as someone from Long Island. I wish that animals didn't have to die for our food, but it's like a very luxurious position to take. I do think there are places where that is the norm. That is a better way to eat than to not eat animals, right? And so you have to have a realistic approach to it, especially if you're thinking on the level of what makes sense for us to eat. Like the same way I'm not eating apples in San Juan, I don't think I should be reliant on coconut and cashews for my fat and dairy when I'm in New York. And so it just starts to make more sense. And I don't think there's any one way the world should eat. I think that's part of the problem, is thinking there is one solution for all the billions of people on the planet. And then that gets us into that question of like, well, how do you feed the whole world? And it's like, that's the wrong question. It's like, how do we feed the people where we are in a way that sustains them and sustains the local ecology, but also, we're interdependent on everything. So.
Well, and then I guess so much of the food we see globally is often like big multinational CPG food. So like that, like there's a scale to that, this ability to sort of have a big nut butter brand or a candy bar. We don't even know the supply chains of those businesses. That food could be coming from anywhere and then is available everywhere.
Yes.
It totally defeats the purpose of like going to a fruit stand in San Juan versus going to, Union Square Farmers Market. And there is where you're really seeing represented what's growing locally. But people, I think, this is, I think, very prevalent in New York. There is a good deal of people with money who follow diet or health trends, then as a result lose sight on the cooking and local aspect because that might not be the fad of the moment. Right. And farm to table has maybe been a fad, which is maybe a good thing.
Yeah.
But cooking is difficult. People don't have time for that. I worry, like if the farm to table fad, which shouldn't be a fad, it should be a way of life. And
agree.
Farm to people. It should be a way of life. If that fad, God forbid, becomes, a fad and not a way of life, like what are we left with?
Right. And I think that's where people with my job come in. Obviously, this is an economic issue that is, people not having time to cook, people not having space to cook, the tools to cook. These are problems that are not alleviated by a beautiful apple, or a beautiful block of local butter. And that's another thing that needs to be addressed in order for people to actually be able to come to cooking with some sort of enthusiasm. I think those aspects of it need to be addressed as well, obviously. But as a food writer, as someone who works in lifestyle media or lifestyle journalism, I think our job is to keep people excited about the things that are a public good. But I do think that food media, for the most part, doesn't consider itself journalistic in service to the public good. I think food media is something that sees itself as something that is supposed to sort of see where the wind is blowing and then tell people what they want to hear. Whereas I think about food writing and food journalism as something that is supposed to help people know the reality and the stakes of the situation. And so when we're talking about what is a fad and what isn't, I think that it's the writers and the journalists who need to be explaining these things to people, that it can't be a fad to eat locally or regionally, because that's simply a way to eat in order to protect your local farmers, protect your local ecosystem, be in conversation with your own surroundings. But people let it be a trend in media, and then it becomes that way because we're moving on so fast with how content creation is. And it's always just like, let's get some attention. Let's make things a fad that shouldn't be a fad. Let's not really tell the truth about the stakes of climate change, the role of the global food system in greenhouse gas emissions. It's responsible for 1/3 of greenhouse gas emissions. Yeah. This is something that no one is ringing the alarm bells about in a way that makes it seem important to make different choices. You know, even this week, the New York Times was like, meat is back. And it's like, where did it go? Where did it go? And so it's just
I think
like,
the cost just went up. I don't think it went anywhere.
I know, it's just like, what are you talking about? It's like with the little American flag in the steak. Horrifying. It's that sort of a thing where it's saying like, I'm going to indulge the worst instincts of Americans, frankly, when it comes to food, which is just eat the meat and don't think about it. And I've been banging this drum for a long time, but I do think that food writers and lifestyle media have a role to play in terms of making people understand these things. I've seen how I think we've done a lot of good things in terms of talking about fast fashion. Like with fashion media, they understand that overconsumption is a problem and they're trying to explain that. Are they doing the greatest job all the time? No. But like I think that being named as a problem and being something that, they're writing stories around and creating work around is something that food media just is not doing in any way. Like when they talk about the future of food, it ends up always being like half an egg with a laser beam through it or something, and like an avocado pit in some blue liquid or whatever. Like I don't know, it's just weird stuff. It's like it's all these things that they're trying to sell us a future that is likely never going to actually bear out in terms of the science and the land use and the energy use. They're just trying to be like, everything is going to be okay. Like the tech guys are on it. Pepsi's on it. Yeah. PepsiCo is going to make sure that you keep eating, even if it's like a fake, I don't know what. I'm thinking of literally a very specific magazine with like a laser beam in it.
I feel like I've seen that. Yeah.
Yes. And so like, but I think it's our job to tell people the truth and not be like the tech guys at PepsiCo are going to fix the future. That's very bizarre.
Well, and I don't want to, I know you've spoken a lot about plant-based, so I want to talk a little more about policy and regional foods. But on the plant-based side, just because I'm passionate a bit about this because I talk a lot to many smaller farmers, whether they're right or wrong or whether I'm right or wrong, like seem very, very convinced that like sustainable animal agriculture plays a very important role in sustainable farming. Yeah. We all agree that we eat too much meat, but a lot of farmers say like if we eat no meat, that's a problem. It's not that everyone needs to eat meat, but some people need to enjoy it, and we should use every part of the animal. What worried me about the whole like sort of like plant-based became cool was all of the money that was mostly funded by like whether it was Cargill or Pepsi or even Tyson or Purdue. Like these are big meat brands that are now seeing return on investment potential in my opinion, unhealthy plant-based trend. And eating plants is very healthy, for the record. So I wanted to get your take on like, whether it's Beyond or Impossible or any other of these, seemingly dozens of brands that popped up and had millions of dollars overnight. What was your thought on all of that?
I hate it.
Okay.
I hate it. No, so when it first came out, I always frame it, and I framed it this way in my book too, which is just like, there was this moment in 2015 or whatever when like GQ said Superiority Burgers made the burger of the year, and it was made with quinoa and onions and carrots and all this stuff. And I was like, oh, we've made it to a good moment. I think we're going to see some turnaround.
It's a great burger.
David Chang puts Impossible Burger in Momofuku Nishi, and then it was like, oh my God. And then it was like $1,026 Impossible Burgers. And it's like, it's made with soy, which is great. I love soy. But like, it's made with, when they started selling at Burger King, they moved to genetically modified soy to meet the demand. You're not asking any questions about the nutritional impacts. Like nutrition is a dirty word in food media, and like you're just not supposed to think about whether anything has any, which is so antithetical to how people think about food, or like most people want to eat something delicious, but also they want to meet their nutritional needs. They know that they feel better if they do. So like that is a dirty word. So you're not supposed to ask questions about like the health impacts or the nutrition impacts. You're not supposed to ask about where are they getting these soybeans? Like, what are the conditions on the farm? What's the pesticide use like? What are the working conditions? And then there's a lot of vegans who just become immediate boosters of these products, whether it's Impossible or Beyond, because they are plant-based. even though we know nothing about them. They're made with proprietary technology. Like the heme of an Impossible Burger is some sort of bleeding yeast extracts, fermented or whatever, like precision fermentation. They decide on all these new phrases that mean nothing so they can get around people's legitimate questions about how their product is made. And so, though they came out of the gate and stole the valor, I think, of like a real veggie burger and changed people's minds about what a veggie burger was or could be, and really just like took over the whole plant-based space in terms of the narrative and the conversation. And it is one of those things that food media was really excited to accept because it got them to pass the buck and to say, oh, these are the people working on the problem and they're going to fix it. So nothing about your life is going to have to change. Your burger's just going to become an Impossible Burger. Like, don't worry about it. And so those things are like, it just was like manufactured to personally annoy me, but also to like not be, just not solve any problems. It was such a money grab that was so obvious. And as you're saying, Smithfield, Cargill, Tyson all put their money in it. They all put their money in plant-based meats, in like cultivated meat startups, whatever. So like they could profit off both ends. They stole this narrative from vegan food or from vegetarian food in a way that like reinstated these bad stereotypes about vegan food, which is that it's like something you buy off a shelf and it's ready to go. Like Veganese, it's like, I don't know, Just Egg or something like that. Like it's just a product you buy and it replaces the thing that came from the planet. Now it's like in a tube. And anyway, and these are things that for most people are not enticing. Like, I'm sorry, like squeezing egg out of a bottle like ketchup is weird. Like,
yeah,
that's not like delicious. Like that's not enjoyable. Meanwhile, you can use chickpea flour and do, anyway, the same thing. They stole the narrative away from real food in terms of plant-based food, and that was really annoying to me. And frankly, just really bad in terms of the narrative around why this plant-based transition was needed to become desirable. Like, why does plant-based eating need to become desirable? Because people in wealthy nations, affluent nations, consume far too much meat, far too much everything, but consume, in terms of this conversation, far too much meat in a way that greatly outpaces the ability to generate that amount of meat sustainably, And we know that we have factory farming, which terrible conditions for animals. We have worker injuries and repetitive motion injuries, inhumane conditions for animal factory farming workers. Alice Driver's book, The Life and Death of the American Worker, is really great on that subject. And then, it's just not sustainable. Like when you're talking to smaller farmers, the idea that it has to be all or nothing is just such a false idea. And the idea is that it has to be less. Like it's a very hard thing to hold in a human head, including my own, to be like, oh, I'm going to consume this sometimes under certain conditions and not other times, and to like maintain that and to be really, committed to that. Like it does take commitment, it takes thought, it takes maybe traveling a little farther out of your way for something, but that commitment is, not to get into a voting with your dollar sort of a thing, but that commitment is a commitment to the world you want to live in, 100%. And so I find it difficult when smaller animal farmers do this thing where it's like, well, plant-based is bad because they're not going to eat, you can't just eat no meat. We have all these animals. They serve a purpose on our land. It's like, yeah, that's fine. I have a friend, Natalie McGill, in Virginia at Perennial Roots Farm, and she has cows and lambs and sheep and pigs. And do I like it as a vegetarian? No. But like, she's really great with those animals and they serve a purpose on her land. And then she has a meat CSA where they're using all of the animal for everything. And so those things are important. And like finding your way to be committed to less meat, even if you can't do no meat, is just, that's perfectly fine. Like, I think that people hear plant-based and they picture some sort of like, I don't know, like a vegan is going to pop up out of the woodwork and be like, hey, don't eat that. But it's like, no, like you can eat what you need to eat, and you can keep these thoughts about locality, sustainability, workers in your mind at the same time.
I think completely. And I think going a little bit further into that, because I just think it's fascinating. When you think about and this was something I don't eat at Burger King often or ever, but for a moment I lived near a Burger King and I would walk by and there was the like Impossible Burger. I haven't seen that sign in a while, so I'm assuming maybe quietly they like took that off the menu. I don't know if it's still on the menu.
I haven't been keeping up with this since the book came out because I don't have to, but I do think these products have stopped selling. We do know that.
Yeah.
Like absolutely, they had like a little bit of a peak in the beginning of the pandemic when people were looking for alternatives to stocking up on meat. That's the interesting thing. It's like when a crisis hit, people are like, oh, alternative proteins. And it's like, yes, always think that. And so but they stopped selling well, Beyond and Impossible, like just doing terribly. And like, I think it is because anecdotally speaking, they're not nutritionally ideal. Like people don't feel great when they eat them. Their ingredients are opaque. I think if you put me in charge of everything, we could take all the meat out of McDonald's and Burger King and Wendy's and put these things in, and that would be great. But that's not happening.
I'm so glad you said that, because that was exactly what I was going to say. I think, unfortunately, I don't know if they're still there, maybe, hopefully.
Yeah.
But my initial concern, going back to like the David Chang reference, was like, oh no, all of the like foodie people who could afford to buy good beef that's thoughtfully raised, that's the whole animal, now those people are going to be going and spending their money on Impossible meat at David Chang's restaurant. Like, no, that's like the wrong. Whereas if we could stop buying CAFO meat at McDonald's and at Wendy's and at Burger King and eat a plant-based burger that's not going to make you feel that great, but it's not like Burger King ever made you feel that great, maybe we're net ahead.
Yeah.
But that was my only glimmer of hope there.
Yeah, that unfortunately, like it just didn't.
Fizzled.
It fizzled. Like people, also the cost of it was
higher probably
It was
than beef,
higher. Yeah, so that just didn't, it wasn't working out.
Which
But
then goes to subsidies and all that.
all of that. Yes.
Moving to building a secure future for our communities, and something that I think really comes up in this kind of conversation, particularly in the pandemic, particularly in the crises in Puerto Rico that you got to witness, even in the egg crisis recently here, I think we're all becoming a little bit like, we're getting glimpses of what it might be like to have shelves that aren't always stocked.
Right.
Talk to us a little bit more beyond even just local agriculture. Like, what are some of the like sort of like horrifying potential outcomes here in terms of like food security and why we should be thinking about this?
So, my friend Luis did this really great study after Hurricane Maria in Puerto Rico about farmer food insecurity. He was talking about how if the broader population is facing food insecurity, how are farmers feeding themselves if we're also under ideal circumstances going to be relying on them to produce the food that's going to feed the rest of us. And he did note like the farmers were facing incredible food insecurity after disaster. And that is because of obviously the physical devastation to their farms, and then also the infrastructural devastation, which is not just about electricity and water, though it is about those things. It's also about road closures and being unable to get to the places where there might be food. And so when we're talking about sort of disaster and food insecurity, it becomes like this like multi-level huge problem, obviously, but it also, if you're not supporting your local farmers in good times, they are less able to withstand those bad times. And if they're less able to withstand them, then so are you by default. If my farmer can't feed themselves and they don't have the tools and infrastructure available to get their things up and running again, then I'm not going to have that food access either, and I'm going to be stuck with whatever is available that is usually processed and imported, and then also trying to keep that food available without power is a whole other ballgame. So, when we're all these infrastructural problems create a cascading effect of further problems. And so I think that it's important to, when you're talking about like the glimmers of seeing what happens during a disaster, whether that disaster is a pandemic or a hurricane, I think that it should be making people slightly more aware of these vulnerabilities in their supply chains, in their food supply chains, and asking themselves what they can do to shorten their supply chains in order to be supporting their local resilient infrastructure in terms of agriculture specifically. And, what can you start doing now? What can you change about how you eat and cook now that makes you less susceptible to that? I had an event on Saturday with my friend Joe Yonan, who put out a book called Mastering the Art of Plant-Based Cooking. It's a great book and it's like really thick, but I had an essay in it and I wrote it like in 2022 where I was like, don't bake with eggs. Obviously, like I contributed vegan baking recipes. And so I was like, don't bake with eggs. Like stock your kitchen with agar, have cornstarch, have arrowroot, have flax seeds, have a variety of things on hand that you can bake or cook with in other ways, because, eggs should be something that you think a bit more thoughtfully about, that you should be buying I use the word should, you could be buying a little bit more expensive of an egg to support a local farmer, but it's going to probably taste better. You're going to ultimately feel better about it, which is it's also an important aspect of, I think, eating and cooking. And then you get to use them in a way that actually makes sense for eating. Instead of, if you're making a chocolate chip cookie, you can use cornstarch, you can use flaxseed, and it'll be just as good, if not better. So there's a notion that scarcity becomes very specific, right? Like scarcity becomes no eggs, no butter, no meat. But if you look at other things you can use and what other ways you can approach ingredients, whether it's using tofu or beans or making yourself some oat milk from oats, which costs such little money per pound, all these things that you can change about your habits in very small increments make you as a person, as a cook, more resilient for any sort of disaster that might befall you.
Totally. And we've seen the number of independent small farmers across the country really start to dwindle. It's pretty scary. Yeah. The average age of the farmer is over 60. There's a lot of problems there. What role should government play in supporting regional food system? And I mean, this is a loaded question now. Where are they falling short?
I mean, the government had been doing, we've read all these stories about what's happened when the federal government has pulled, billions of dollars from funding for small farmers who were going to sell their wares to institutions, to food banks. This model was helping a lot of people stay afloat, and it was making sure that people at food banks or people in schools got to eat well-made food from their regional food system. And so pulling that funding is just absurd, considering the myriad crises that we face. The crises that we face in just the last year in terms of climate-related disasters in the United States. And so we're weakening so much what is possible. And then, as you're saying, it's getting more and more difficult for young people to stay in agriculture because it is so difficult. It's a difficult job under any circumstances, but it's a more difficult job when expenses become higher. You see funding wiped out. You also see your consumer base struggling financially. And so what is going to happen? We don't know. But I do think there is a role to play in supporting the people who are teaching people to farm, to garden, and that sort of thing, on top of the obvious, massive help for small farmers to bring their food to people. We're seeing the opposite of that happening now. They're getting no help. And then meanwhile, of course, the billions of dollars in subsidies for big ag. This is something I talk about all the time, with people, because they're always like, how are we doing it? How are we getting the money to make local food accessible? It's like, we're spending all that money keeping Cargill and, we're spending all that money keeping these awful companies in business.
Exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's exactly, I think when you look at grant funding getting shut off, if you want to think about grants and subsidies, because grants are sort of subsidies for small, more for small, not only. I mean, big companies can get grants too, but the grants have acted as ways to get local food into schools or solar onto a small farm or different things like that, which also the way grants often can be paid out. This is something that was talking to a small farmer about this. Had a grant for solar. They then go out and finance the solar, but the grant needs to reimburse them. Now, what do? The grant is held up.
Yes.
They are now on the hook for the solar. So they went ahead and spent the $50,000 or whatever it was, and now we're not guaranteed that they're going to get the $50,000. And they're like, we never would have done the solar if we had to pay for it, which is also a problem. So solar might be the way to go, but they don't have the 10-year horizon to see the sort of payback, and the grant was what was going to float that sort of investment. So I think that's really interesting. Going back to governments, though, and the flaws with subsidies, subsidies could be a force for good. I also think the public, even myself, like, we don't know enough about any of this. So let's use this conversation to share.
Well, I mean, I think that's precisely the problem, is these subsidies could be used for good. Does the public know how much of their food is subsidized by the government in terms of meat and dairy? No. Like, I think, the last statistic I saw, it was like 38 billion for meat and dairy and 17 million for vegetables and protein. And then, a lot of this money is going to corn and soy. Like, if you drive through most of the country, it's like corn and soy, because those are feeding the livestock.
But that's feed. I don't know if that's even counted as, like, those are subsidized, I think, to the tune of a lot more than 17 million.
No, they're
You're talking
part
about
of
kale.
livestock.
Kale's not subsidized.
Kale is not subsidized. No, it should be. Like,
I agree.
But like, exactly. It's a difficult conversation to have with people because they think of the price of meat and dairy and eggs as some sort of natural price, and the price of produce isn't. They think of these things as very like natural, like they sort of just emerge at the supermarket. It's like, well, of course, yes, meat costs this and kale costs this and organic kale costs this and organic meat costs this. And it's like, these things are much more complicated than that. Like, you are being driven toward a certain style of eating. Absolutely. And I think that people, when you say, oh, if you eat more plant-based or more vegetable forward, they don't see it the same way as the government with subsidies steering their food choices towards big agribusiness. And cheap food subsidizes people's bad wages. And I think that's an under-discussed aspect of it. It's like, and cheap clothes, the exploitation from cheap clothing subsidizes people's wages. These are real things. Like, and again, I go back to where are people in communicating this to the public? Like, these are important things for the public to understand, which is that as much as you wanting a hamburger or a steak is as natural as wanting a diamond ring for an engagement ring. These things can be changed. We've made them in an image that flatters a certain concept of an American who eats lots of red meat and not a lot of vegetables. I mean, even now, like, the carnivores are like, you don't eat any vegetables, you don't eat any fruit. It's like, it's so scary. And so, like, I was just like, okay. But, like, you can change. We made this system that's bad and that is killing our planet and killing us, killing animals in numbers that is so excessive and disgusting.
And our soil.
Everything. And we can change that not as easily as we built it, but like, we can change that. We are in charge of that. I think there's this kind of like the way people are obsessed or had been obsessed. I think people are over it now, saying no ethical consumption under capitalism. It was just a way of saying, like, the problem is somewhere else. So I don't have to think about it. I don't have to touch it. I'm just little old me, and my autonomy is meaningless. And I think that's such a bad, like, why do you want to go through life thinking your choices are meaningless and having no effect on other people and the ways in which things are operating in the world? I think it's important for people to understand these big subsidies for agribusiness, like the way, even the phrasing of the grants for small farmers versus the subsidies. It's like, oh, the grant is just something nice that we're giving them versus a subsidy is what they need to exist. Like, what would happen if we stopped subsidizing livestock and actually ate in a way that made sense? What if we stopped using all this land for corn and soy and used it for a far more diversity of ingredients? Like, what would happen? Like, but I think it's important for people's imaginations to get there before we can make it happen. Because if tomorrow we like flipped a switch and all of a sudden there was very little meat and it was very expensive, and only a little bit of dairy and it was expensive, but like you had robust options in terms of grains and legumes and vegetables and fruits, people would be freaked out. That would be bizarre to people. So like, we do have to get there imaginatively before we can get there in reality, I think.
Totally. I think to add to that, and also like kind of maybe hopefully strike a chord, like when you think about subsidies versus grants, and I think this is like really interesting, these companies that benefit from subsidies also hire lobbyists. So like, it's almost like they're going out for funding and they're paying a lot of money. So this is where I think when we think about our own role, and we have all unfortunately very little say in any of this, but when you think about local politics, and I think this is one of the crazy, like very like both sides of the aisle are equally like awful. And you look at like who they're supporting when it comes to the farm bill and these subsidies, they're both supporting big ag. That's why food is, to me, such a really polarizing and problematic topic in general. It's like both sides of the aisle like really aren't there to make sure that our farmers are taken care of and that
Right.
your health is looked after, right?
No, they absolutely get it wrong completely. And it's because the lobbyists are spending so much money. There was a great piece by Tom Philpott in Mother Jones it was before RFK Jr. became the head of the AHA. So he wrote a piece about like, why do they get it so wrong? And like, why were seemingly progressive people like sort of optimistic about what could happen if you had someone in a high position of government who did sort of vaguely understand that corporate food is bad on multiple levels. And like, I remember when New York Magazine did their package on it, it was like Marion Nestle and Bernie Sanders were like, maybe something could, like, they're just like desperate for anything good to happen. And so like, they were like tentatively like, maybe, but it's just not going to happen because the pockets are lined. It's because we as citizens, as human beings, as a collective, let food be a niche concern, a bourgeois affectation, a silly thing to care about, and we don't talk about it enough. We just don't care enough. Obviously not us in this room, but like I do think that's again why I talk about the imagination. That's again why I talk about food media having a journalistic responsibility to the public good to tell them the truth about these things. It's because until we have this stuff straight in our heads about how important it is for our future, for our present pleasures, future survival and resilience, we are cooked. We're not ready for it.
Totally. I agree. And I think I appreciate you bringing the media perspective to the conversation. And I think the media, it does bother me a lot, like how everything feels very clickbaity, and most of the stuff that food magazines write about is either like the hot new chef or the new restaurant or the new food fad or the new poppy getting bought for $2 billion and no one can shut up about it. And yet, all of these really important things are really neglected.
Yeah.
So how can I guess from the food media perspective, and I guess consumer, we need to stop clicking on this chef did this thing wrong or whatever, and more, how do we reposition all of us thinking about building environmental security going forward and thinking regionally and all of that? Is it possible to reshift the public discussion? Because again, media drives what we're talking about at the dinner table.
Yeah, no, I think that, paying attention to and supporting outlets that care about these issues is significant. We have to make sure that these outlets stay alive in a media landscape that is shrinking and fragmented and collapsing, and pay attention to people who talk about food in a way that is meeting the moment in terms of the polycrisis, to use a goofy word. But I think that, that's the thing. We do have to support that. We have to, and I mean, there's cookbooks that people love and buy a lot of, and it becomes a bestseller, and it's got a big steak on the cover and that sort of thing. These things matter to how things get perceived, and yeah.
When you write about things and pitch them to certain media publications, do you get edited? Do you get told let's not talk, or we don't want to pick that up?
I don't pitch Bon Appetit to the New York Times cooking section. I'm just not going to write for them because it just doesn't make any sense.
And is it, but isn't that also that's I want to be reading Alicia Kennedy in not just me, I'll read you anyway, but I want people to read you. And that's to me, the problem is the voices that are telling it the way it needs to be told are also not on the platforms that, are generally mainstream. Exactly.
Yeah, no, I mean, Ligaya Michon does probably the best mainstream food writing, the best food writing in a mainstream publication. She's at the New York Times Style magazine. So she's she's not in the cooking section. She's in the Style magazine. So you have to be have a certain interest to open that magazine up in the first place. And, I write for Food Print, which is a great nonprofit, the Bittman Project by Mark Bittman. There's few places to write about food in a way, Civil Eats, of course. But I think people who write about food in this way get kind of sidelined into a weird position of oh, they're the policy people, they're the activists. And it doesn't get taken seriously as food writing because it does take into account other elements of what touches food and agriculture. Whereas a lot of people perceive food writing to be is make me hungry, yum, yum, yum. So it's and that's not, we need that. We always need that, but we don't need that all the time.
No, and we need this a little bit more. Yeah. All right, last question. we've talked a lot about the issues, but what gives you hope right now when it comes to the future of local food and community-based systems, particularly in both Puerto Rico and we'll go with New York because we're here?
Sure. Well, I think the fact that people are having to deal with terrible things going on, I think the effects of bird flu on egg, the way the tariffs are going to affect food costs, I think people are going to have to start to understand where their food is coming from and how they can navigate their grocery shopping in a way that isn't exorbitantly expensive. I think that from my perspective, bad things have to happen for people to change their mindset. And that's simply a pattern of human behavior. I feel like hope is such a difficult word at this juncture. It's like, I think that considering, how can we have, solidarity among each other is maybe more useful than hope, because I do think I'm a little bit of a doomer, frankly. I think that we're a little bit beyond hope. And so I just think about how we can sort of accept our interdependence as people, as regions, as geographies, and try and do our best for that going forward, rather than have a more, self-centered approach to, especially like what we're talking about, food. Sometimes it has to be, this is what I want to eat and I'm going to eat it right now. But other times, like if we can think of most of the time about like, how is this reflecting on the world I want to live in and that sort of thing. I know, which sounds sort of hokey and but I think that that's the only way I could think of hope, is to think of just considering more the interdependence.
Yeah. Well, on that note, thank you for being a voice of reality and of calling things the way they are and need to be called. And I think, personally, I know, speaking for our team and many people I know, we really appreciate what you stand for and what you do. And I hope to see you on whatever platforms you want to be on. But I think it's really cool also that you've built your own, following you on social as well. I think there's nothing like self-distribution, even though you could argue that Zuckerberg owns that too, but whatever. On that note, thank you so much, Alicia, for being here. I really appreciate it. Thank you for listening to Know Your Food, a podcast from Farm to People. If today's conversation got you thinking differently about what's on your plate or where it comes from, we'd love if you shared this episode with a friend or left us a review. It helps more people discover the folks reimagining the future of food from the ground up. And if you're in the New York tri-state area, you can shop from our network of small, regenerative, independent farms and makers at farmtopeople.com and stay in the loop by signing up for our newsletter or joining us on Instagram at farmtopeople. Until next time, eat well and know your food.